Welcome to Community Roundtable. I'm Nick Burns from the Salt Lake Community College Communication Department, and I'm your host as we explore topics of special interest and concern to the residents of the cities and also the unincorporated areas of Salt Lake County, topics that we feel are equally important to the general public throughout all the state of Utah. Today, on this very special episode of Community Roundtable, we welcome Utah Senator Mike Lee, and we have plenty to talk about, from public education to public lands, from Washington gridlock to immigration reform to campaign finance reform. We'll hear Senator Lee's philosophy on serving his constituents here in Utah, and we'll talk about a couple issues where the right and the left are busy working together. Senator Lee and the DC perspective right here in Utah today on Community Roundtable. Senator Lee, thanks.
Thank you, Nick. It's good to be with you.
Oh, I appreciate it totally. So I have to jump in here as a place to start. Here you are at Salt Lake Community College. What role, there's a lot of controversy about this. What role do you see for the federal government in higher education in the states?
Well, in higher education, we've got an economy, an information age economy, in which students tend to get educated in one state and perhaps move to another state. And so there is a much more compelling argument to be made about the federal government's involvement, about the need for the federal government's involvement in higher education. And it has taken on this role as being a significant source of funding for higher education. So with the federal government playing that role, we've got to make sure it does an efficient job in doing it, and that it allocates that money, those funds, in a way that will hopefully help keep the cost of higher education under control, rather than facilitating a spiral that will make it harder for lower income students to get a higher education.
So you're not in that camp of folks that say the feds should just bail out of higher ed completely and leave it to the states?
No, and I don't know that many people who are advocating that. There are a lot out there who don't see there being a strong role for the federal government to play in primary and secondary education.
Right.
And the higher education component is quite different.
Certainly. So here at Salt Lake Community College, we are by far the largest institution here in the state, but last year 30,000 students here required some sort of financial aid to finish school here. And I wonder, what are your thoughts on, like you say, you see a role for federal involvement, but wow, that's 1 out of every 2 students here needs some kind of aid.
Yeah, it's a lot, and that's why we've got to make sure that this system functions as effectively and efficiently as it can, and most importantly in a manner that will help keep costs down.
Okay.
It's one reason why I've introduced my Higher Education Reform Act. The idea is to preserve our existing system, but create the potential for states to design their own alternative accrediting tracks, their own alternative accrediting bodies, which, if they chose to exercise that right, could lead to the development of more institutions of higher learning. More people could enter this marketplace, this industry. Whenever you got more competition in a particular field, you're going to keep prices under control. And I think, especially with the development of massive open online courses, or MOOCs as they're sometimes known, there's a big opportunity for Congress to step in and say, there ought to be a mechanism whereby MOOCs can participate in Title IV federal funding.
Oh, interesting. I know there's a lot of controversy over that notion of alternative accrediting associations. What do we have, 7 or 8 regional bodies now? And then for things like alternative medicine, we have separate accrediting bodies. So it sounds like you're a fan of this move towards more online education.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think you see a lot of brick and mortar institutions of higher learning already moving in that direction, and that they're incorporating that into their curriculum. There are also some outside entities that may not yet exist, or at least not yet exist as a brick and mortar, that might be able to provide some specialized training. Maybe not a 4-year degree, but perhaps a professional certification, or perhaps a series of training modules that are designed to help people in a particular field. Some of those ought to have at least a chance at participating in Title IV funding.
So, we do that here now. We train Honda mechanics, we do specialized courses for American Express employees, but you just see room for more.
Yeah, I see room for more. Our existing accrediting system works pretty well, and it works really well for the existing brick and mortar entity. But I think as we move as we complete our transition into the information age economy, there's going to be even more demand for higher education. It's going to be a must for most Americans. Now, that doesn't mean that all Americans will necessarily want to pursue a PhD or even necessarily a 4-year degree.
No.
A lot of them may want to pursue some sort of professional certification or a less formal, less lengthy
Sure.
job training. those people ought to be able to participate in the same funding mechanism.
Okay. So I want to ask about a recent blog post that you wrote about welcoming children home, and I want to get the quote right. Welcoming children home to, quote, an America that leaves no one behind, end quote. And I wonder, in terms of education, who should be assuring that no one's left behind? How do you see that working in terms of education?
In terms of higher education, I think that certainly the states are playing the leading role in this, and it's the states that are putting together the funding, the necessary funding for great schools like Salt Lake Community College, like the University of Utah, and like the other schools in our state system. There's also a role for the federal government to play, given its provision of Pell Grants, its provision of subsidized student loans, and so forth. And again, the role the federal government has got to play there is to make sure that it's providing that funding in a way it's most likely to be conducive to the provision of more affordable education alternatives.
So what do you think of the notion that some people have advocated that it would actually be cheaper for the federal government to just pay the students' tuition, that the federal government could actually spend less by making at least two-year colleges free instead of all the bureaucracy to run the Pell Grants and the loans and that system now? There's a number, I mean, the Lumina Foundation, other folks are doing research about just making, grade 13 and 14 free.
Interesting. So the idea, I mean, I haven't heard of this specific idea, but what you're saying is that it would be a direct payment of tuition to the institution rather than to the student, and that it would focus primarily on community colleges rather than a four-year institution.
Well, it could be. The research I read, of course, is two-year because that's my bias. But the statistics I read was the federal government's into almost $70 billion a year now for Pell Grants and running all the programs and the financial aid loans and all of that. And for I think the number was $63 billion. You could just pay the schools directly and have it be free for the students.
Look, anything that could save that much money is worth looking into. I hadn't heard of that proposal previously. I'm happy to have a look at it.
It's being floated around. And I wonder too what you think, and I want to move on to other issues, but also the notion where loan paybacks would be dependent on income. So rather than saying you borrow $25,000 to go to school and make payments on $25,000, you get your tuition money up front and then you pay, I think Oregon's talking about 2% of your income.
Yeah, a lot of states have experimented with this. A lot of private schools have also done so, and I understand they've had some good success with it. I think each state ought to have the option of deciding whether or not to do this, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Do you know if anybody in the Senate or the House is pushing that on a national level?
I don't think so. I think it would be difficult, at least at this point, to push something like that on the national level because, this might work with some degrees better than with others. It might work at some schools better than with others. I haven't heard of anyone wanting to push that on a national level.
I mean, I could see concerns where, gosh, then some student just wants to stay in school forever and you could keep flunking your courses and keep going. So I think you'd need some sort of other accountability issues similar to what we have now. If you fail, you have to pay back your loans, not take any more. So plenty to work on. But thank you. I want to move on to talk about some other things, if that's okay. And I was really intrigued by something you said to the Heritage Foundation a couple months ago. And you said that many Republicans today are still advocating and pushing policies from what you called a bygone era. I was very intrigued by that, and I wonder how bygone are we talking about, and could you give me some examples of what you think Republicans are pushing wrongly?
Sure. So by the time we get to 2016, we will be about as far, almost as far away from 1980 when America elected Ronald Reagan as 1980 was from D-Day. So we're talking about a huge demographic and generational and chronological swing. And so we've got to continue to re-message who it is that we are and reimagine what it is that we stand for, re-envision what good government looks like. So we can't continue to rely on I love Ronald Reagan as a catchphrase that's intended to solve all of the world's problems. What I've been saying is that we've got to stop talking about Ronald Reagan and start acting like him. And Ronald Reagan was very wise in the fact that he was able to focus in on a few principles and continue to return to those principles again and again because he believed in them, and to advocate passionately on behalf of them and to figure out where he could make some progress.
So it sounds like more you're talking about a messaging, not an actual policy shift in terms
it's
of
both.
what the policy. Okay.
It's both. So the policies, if someone tried to push the same foreign policy or the same military strategy today as we were pushing in 1980, that would really be unwise. You know, we've got a different set of enemies. In some ways, they're some of the same enemies, but they appear in very different forms. And we've got a new group of potential threats to the United States that didn't exist in 1980.
Is that what you see with some of the warmongering and saber rattling over Ukraine? Is that throwback to the Cold War that we ought to be moving past?
Well, to my knowledge, nobody's really advocating vigorously on behalf of the proposition that we ought to be getting involved militarily. We ought to have a direct military intervention with Russia and Ukraine.
So on, I mean.
But yeah, we certainly wouldn't want to revert to a Cold War strategy that focused on a bipolar world, that focused on two superpowers running the world, because we live in a much different environment today.
It ain't that world now.
That's
All
right.
right, thank you. I want to ask about public lands. That this sort of revival of the Sagebrush Rebellion is huge. We've seen it in Nevada recently. And I wonder, in terms of your own work in D.C., what could you advocate, or what would you consider a suitable compromise that would, give local control to all this federal land in the West here, but yet also recognize that, people in New York own this land as well, that it belongs to all of us?
I like the way you set up the question. I think the premise from which you approach the question is perfect. The people in New York and the people in Florida and the people in Hawaii own federal public land. The federal government owns it, and we've got owners all over the country in the form of citizens and taxpayers. But the fact that they own it and the fact that they benefit from it in different parts of the country emphasizes the fact that the burden associated with that amount of federal land ought not be disproportionately placed on the citizens of states like Utah and Nevada, where the federal government owns most of the land. So in New York, the federal government owns less than 1/2% of the land. They own about 2/3 of our land, about more than 80% of Nevada's land. If the federal government's going to own that much land, it needs to offset the cost of that to the state and local governments. One of the reasons why we are behind the curve in terms of per student school funding in Utah is that in many, if not most of our counties, most of the land is beyond the authority of the local taxing jurisdiction, normally the county, to collect property tax. And property tax is an important part of the revenue stream used by our local governments, our search and rescue teams, our fire departments, our law enforcement operations, and our education system. So if the federal government's going to own that much land, it needs to behave like a landowner, and it needs to provide to the states and to their taxing jurisdictions within the states something approaching a tax payment. It needs to pay the rough equivalent of a property tax.
As opposed to the system now where there's some sort of county-wide payment.
Right, there's a county-wide payment for BLM lands only that deals with, it's based on a complex mathematical formula that ends up, in most cases, paying pennies on the dollar compared to what they would receive if they were receiving property tax.
If it was property tax, regardless. I know different states figure that differently. Do you think the Sagebrush Rebellion folks would be happy if the land remained in public ownership, but the county's got, something akin to property tax?
I think it would certainly help by starting a dialogue, a national conversation about why it is that the federal government needs to own that much land. Now, keep in mind, I'm not talking here about national parks, not talking about national recreation areas. I'm talking about the garden variety BLM land, the sort of sagebrush land that's just out there. Why does the federal government need to own that much land? And I think if it were paying property taxes or the functional equivalent thereof, people would be more aware of this disparity. They'd be more aware of the fact that this does come at a cost, and there would be more public inquiry into whether or not the federal government really needs to own all that land.
If they had to pay all the tax, they might want to sell some of it.
Some of it, yeah.
Interesting. So let me ask about bankruptcies here in Utah. Utah for years now is pretty much at the top end of the scale in terms of bankruptcies, over 7,500 in the first half of 2013. But yet at the same time, we have about the lowest unemployment in the nation. So as a senator, do you see a role for Congress in bankruptcy issues at the state level?
Well, certainly there is a role for Congress, because that is our bankruptcy laws are primarily federal. They're handled in bankruptcy courts, which are themselves creatures of the federal government. There are different explanations as to why Utah's rate is that high. I've got friends who are bankruptcy lawyers who tell me that one of the reasons why Utah's rate appears high has more to do with how Utah's bankruptcy rules, its local practice rules, require people to proceed. That sometimes it tends to inflate the number of bankruptcies per capita that are actually occurring.
So in other words, if the Utah families were in a different state, they might not have to legally go through bankruptcy?
Or what might appear as multiple bankruptcies in Utah might appear as one bankruptcy elsewhere.
Interesting.
But regardless, yeah, there is a federal role there because this is a federal function.
Yeah, okay. So currently there's a lot of consternation, a lot of disagreement over banking regulations. Where do you think the feds are too strong or too light on Wall Street?
Well, I don't know that you can categorically say that they're either too strong or too light, so much as you can say that we've got a lot of rules that are being made every day and then changing from one day to the next. We've got so many overlapping regulatory jurisdictional questions where you've got the Federal Reserve, you've got the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and you've got other federal entities and other state entities that may step in from time to time. And so what you have is a circumstance in which there's this complex labyrinth of regulations that affect the banking industry. This is imposing enormous costs on them. And who this is choking out more often than not, more often than anyone else, are the small and mid-sized banks, the community banks, which have much more difficulty complying with this complex labyrinth of federal and state regulations, in part because they can't afford to have an army of lawyers and accountants and lobbyists and other specialists who can help make sure that they're in compliance with an increasingly changing, ever morphing set of regulations.
So like a Heber Valley bank can't very well work across state lines like a Wells Fargo or a Citigroup, right? For lack of all their lawyer firepower.
But yes, but setting aside whether or not they're working across state lines, it can become very difficult for a community bank to function at all if the regulatory burden continues to grow at a time when the bank itself isn't growing at the same rate. That actually ends up inuring quite perversely to the benefit of a few very large banks nationally who will be able to squelch out competition, to be able to push out all other competition, because most competitors won't be able to compete because they can't employ the same number of people to ensure compliance with federal regulations.
So should we drop that magic phrase, too big to fail? For those banks?
Too big to fail is not a popular phrase, and I think if you were to ask most members of Congress on both sides of the aisle and both ends of the Capitol, most of them would be perfectly content to abandon the concept of too big to fail.
Okay, because I think of Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, these companies I want to say are notorious these days for, moving all their profits into offshore tax havens and on and on and on. And so, like you say, they have this advantage that the smaller banks don't to accomplish those kinds of incredible practices.
Right. And it's ironic that a lot of the things that may be put in place in order to prevent that sort of thing from happening might actually produce more institutions that would fit into this category of so big that many would fear national consequences if they failed.
Well, you were the law professor, right? So you could see the more laws they are, the more jobs for, I want to say, sharp lawyers.
Yeah,
right?
I wasn't a law professor. I taught as an adjunct. I was a lawyer, but that is not how we want to grow our economy.
Yeah. So what would you support or what would you see in terms of changing that system?
There is a group of, a bipartisan group of senators that are working on some legislation to try to deal with it. There are a couple of different legislative proposals that are trying to get rid of too big to fail. Senators Sherrod Brown from Ohio and David Vitter from Louisiana are working on some legislation to that effect. It hasn't made its way through the committee yet, but we'll see what comes out of committee.
Is that another example of that right-left working together?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are far more instances of this than than frequently make the news, in part because it's not as much fun to talk about bipartisan cooperation as it is about Democrats and Republicans fighting with each other.
Well, I mean, you're talking to a journalism professor, so a little conflict is something I have to teach my students.
Sure.
But some things we could talk about. I mean, your name is associated with some of that right-left work when it comes to oversight of the NSA, right?
Yes.
So
I'm running legislation with a number of my Democratic colleagues, far more Democrats than Republicans at this point. But Pat Leahy from Vermont, Dick Durbin of Illinois, Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley from Oregon are my partners in several pieces of legislation, all of which are designed to make the NSA more accountable and to put additional restrictions on its ability to invade the privacy of the American people. One of the most important legislative proposals out there is one that would try to focus the NSA on the need to get a warrant if it wants to search for your phone records. Even to search the metadata. If they want to search who you're calling and who's calling you and when those calls are occurring. If you're a U.S. citizen operating on U.S. soil, I think you have an expectation of privacy and the confidentiality of that information. And I don't think they ought to be searching for that information of a U.S. person on U.S. soil without a court warrant. And fortunately, a number of my Democratic colleagues agree with me, and a few of my Republican colleagues do as well.
So what do you make of the Supreme Court decision from the very late 70s that said it's okay for the phone companies basically to give all that information up?
Yeah, so you're referring to Smith versus Maryland. I myself have doubts as to whether or not Smith versus Maryland was correctly decided. But regardless of whether that case was correctly decided, they were dealing there with a very finite data set. A very limited data set, a few calls in and out of a landline over the course of a few days. What we're talking about here is a government that has the capacity now to track and store and search information on who you called and who's called you and when those calls occurred over a period of years. And from a phone that can be uniquely traceable to you if it's your cell phone, because typically people don't share cell phones like they do a landline. And you can come up with all kinds of scenarios in which they could really invade your privacy by analyzing this information. In other words, you can come up with quite a profile for any one individual if you look at this data set, especially over the course of not just days, but months or years.
You bet. Yeah. Do you think the NSA has that data set on yourself as well as me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they have never... they have never acknowledged, they have never claimed that there is anyone who is outside of this.
Who is exempt.
And I think that some people have even asked them, have you exempted out members of Congress? Have you exempted out members of the Supreme Court? And their answers, or their non-answers, seem to suggest that they don't exempt those out. And so this is not why it's a problem, but it's yet another symptom of the problem. Yeah. It's yet another area in which you can see that this is an opportunity that is just teeming with, it is full of opportunities for mischief. Partisan political abuse.
That was delicately put. Opportunities for mischief. How about the Senate and the CIA currently and this back and forth bickering over who's tapping whose computers?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. I don't know all the details on that one, and I think it's going to be some time before we get to the bottom of what exactly happened there.
Do you think the Senate has any ability to accomplish something with the CIA vis-a-vis what you're trying to do with reining in the NSA?
Perhaps, but that one is a much more specific problem. If it's true, if in fact the CIA was monitoring what was going on within not just the Senate, but the very Senate committee tasked with oversight of the CIA, that's a bit of a problem.
I'll say.
But it's also just unwise on the part of those in the NSA who tried to do that. Yeah. It's not very smart to do that to the very entity that's charged with overseeing you. But again, we don't know all the facts on that yet, so I don't want to speculate too much on what actually happened there.
So we've only got about 5 minutes left, and I wonder, just following up on that, folks like Edward Snowden, who are sort of blowing the whistle on the NSA, what do you think about his actions?
Look, I don't ever encourage anyone to break the law, and I certainly don't want to applaud people who break the law. I think when someone sees activity occurring that is wrong, that is illegal, there are usually ways of blowing the whistle without breaking the law. There are usually ways that you can bring a particular issue to those who can do something about it without breaking the law.
Okay.
And according to every report that I've seen, Mr. Snowden broke the law. I will say, in the wake of his breaking the law, certain things have become easier to talk about because there have been a lot of things that have been declassified, things that I was aware of before this happened, but was unable to talk about because it would be in violation of the law. So it gets a lot easier to explain why I voted against the reauthorization of the Patriot Act a few years ago. I was one of the few Republicans who voted against it. I was one of the few Republicans who voted against the reauthorization of the FISA Amendments Act. And it had to do with things like what Mr. Snowden revealed. It had to do with many of these concerns about what the federal government is doing. But I wasn't able to talk about it at the time.
So again, only a couple minutes left here. You mentioned working with Senator Leahy. You mentioned Senator Wyden also. Any other like Democrats or progressives out there who you want to name drop and admire doing good things?
Dick Durbin, the assistant majority leader, Democratic senator from Illinois. He and I are working together on some sentencing reform legislation. It's called the Smarter Sentencing Act. We've looked at our federal prison population, the fact that it's exploded. It's expanded nearly tenfold since 1980. This is not because the number of crimes committed in the United States has increased tenfold since 1980. It has to do with the fact that we have over-federalized criminal law, and we've come to rely within the federal system on a lot of minimum mandatory sentences that in many cases are a little excessive when compared to corresponding state law offenses.
And often disproportionately applied to people of color as well, certainly in drug offenses.
Yeah, and so we have a lot of minorities who are being incarcerated at a much higher rate than their white counterparts. And this too is a concern. This also addresses that by making retroactive the fix on the crack powder to the crack cocaine to powder cocaine disparity.
Right. Do you see that legislation having chance of passing the House and the Senate?
Yes. So it's a little more popular among Democrats than Republicans. It passed the Senate Judiciary Committee a few weeks ago, and I hope and expect it to pass the Senate floor sometime within the next few weeks.
Interesting. Thanks.
Also got a great bipartisan bill with Pat Leahy from Vermont reforming our patent litigation system. We need patent litigation reform because it's being abused right now.
Okay. So 2 minutes left here. You're going to run again in 2 years?
Yes.
Expect a primary challenge?
Who knows? You know, within any political party, there's a diverse array of opinions, and you never know until that filing deadline passes.
And this change here in Utah with the move away from the caucus convention to allow primary votes, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I've been a supporter of the caucus and convention system.
It worked for you.
But that said, I intend to run and I intend to win under any system, including the one adopted by this more recent legislation.
Do you ever anticipate or think about running like for state office, like for governor? Because you seem to be someone who's very into states' rights. You ever think about doing something in Utah instead of the feds?
Well, look, we have one of the best managed state governments in the country, and I think this is a great state. And one of the reasons why I feel so passionately about federalism is because I see a lot of states being unfairly coerced and manipulated by a federal government that has become too big and too expensive. And I think the best way to fight that is within the federal government, and that's what I'm doing.
All right, thanks. And one last question. When can we next expect to visit with you here at Salt Lake Community College?
You name the time. If you want to make it tomorrow, let's talk tomorrow.
All right. Come back and do this show again?
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Senator Lee.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for joining us on Community Roundtable. If you have a comment, if you have a question, maybe you have a show idea for something in the future, get in touch with us. Our email address, roundtable@slcctv.com. And don't forget, you can catch all our shows archived at slcctv.com. I'm Nick Burns. Keep it tuned, SLCC TV.